Chapter 14 of Zastrozzi, a Romance. This recording is in the public domain. Zastrozzi, a Romance, by Percy, Bysshe, Shelley. Chapter 14. The evening was serene. Fleecy clouds floated on the horizon. The moon's full orb, in cloudless majesty, hung high in air, and was reflected in silver brilliancy by every wave of the Adriatic, as, gently agitated by the evening breeze, they dashed against innumerable gondolas which crowded the laguna. Exquisite harmony, borne on the pinions of the tranquil air, floated in varying murmurs. It sometimes died away, and then again swelling louder, in melodious undulations softened to pleasure every listening ear. Every eye which gazed on the fairy scene beamed with pleasure. Unrepressed gaiety filled every heart but Julia's, as with a vacant stare, unmoved by feelings of pleasure, unagitated by the gaiety which filled every other soul, she contemplated the varied scene. A magnificent gondola carried the Marchesa di Strobazzo, and the innumerable flambeaux which blazed around her rivalled the meridian sun. It was the pensive, melancholy Julia, who, immersed in thought, sat unconscious of every external object, whom the fierce glance of Matilda measured with a haughty expression of surprise and revenge. The dark fire which flashed from her eye more than told the feelings of her soul as she fixed it on her rival, and had it possessed the power of the basilisks, Julia would have expired on the spot. It was the ethereal form of the now forgotten Julia which first caught Verezzi's eye. For an instant he gazed with surprise upon her symmetrical figure, and was about to point her out to Matilda, when in the downcast countenance of the enchanting female he recognized his long-lost Julia. To paint the feelings of Verezzi, as Julia raised her head from the attitude in which it was fixed, and disclosed to his view that countenance which he had formerly gazed on in ecstasy, the index of that soul to which he had sworn everlasting fidelity, is impossible. The Lethean torpor, as it were, which before had benumbed him, the charm which had united him to Matilda, was dissolved. All the air-built visions of delight, which had but a moment before floated in gay variety in his enraptured imagination, faded away, and in place of these, regret, horror, and despairing repentance reared their heads amid the roses of momentary voluptuousness. He still gazed entranced, but Julia's gondola, indistinct from distance, mocked his straining eyeball. For a time neither spoke. The gondola rapidly passed onwards, but, immersed in thought, Matilda and Verezzi heeded not its rapidity. They had arrived at St. Mark's Place, and the gondolier's voice, as he announced it, was the first interruption of the silence. They started. Verezzi now, for the first time, aroused from his reverie of horror, saw that the scene before him was real, and that the oaths of fidelity which he had so often and so fervently sworn to Julia were broken. The extreme of horror seized his brain. A frigorific torpidity of despair chilled every sense, and his eyes fixedly gazed on vacancy. "Oh, return, instantly return!" impatiently replied Matilda to the question of the gondolier. The gondolier, surprised, obeyed her, and they returned. The spacious canal was crowded with gondolas. Merriment and splendour reigned around, enchanting harmony stole over the scene. But listless of the music, heeding not the splendour, Matilda sat lost in a maze of thought. Fiercest vengeance revelled through her bosom, and in her own mind she resolved a horrible purpose. Meanwhile the hour was late. The moon had gained the zenith, and poured her beams vertically on the unruffled Adriatic, when the gondola stopped before Matilda's mansion. A sumptuous supper had been prepared for their return. Silently Matilda entered. Silently Verezzi followed. Without speaking, Matilda seated herself at the supper table. Verezzi, with an air of listlessness, threw himself into a chair beside her. For a time neither spoke. "You are not well to-night," at last stammered out Verezzi. "What has disturbed you?" "Disturbed me?" repeated Matilda. "Why do you suppose that anything has disturbed me?" A more violent paroxysm of horror seemed now to seize Verezzi's brain. He pressed his hand to his burning forehead. The agony of his mind was too great to be concealed. Julia's form, as he had last seen her, floated in his fancy, and, overpowered by the resistlessly horrible ideas which pressed upon them, his senses failed him. He faintly uttered Julia's name. He sank forward, and his throbbing temples reclined on the table. "Arise, awake! Prostrate, perjured Verezzi, awake!" exclaimed the infuriate Matilda, in a tone of gloomy horror. Verezzi started up, and gazed with surprise upon the countenance of Matilda, which, convulsed by passion, flashed desperation and revenge. "'Tis plain," said Matilda gloomily, "'tis plain he loves me not." A confusion of contending emotions battled in Verezzi's bosom. His marriage vow, his faith plighted to Matilda, convulsed his soul with indescribable agony. Still did she possess a great empire over his soul. Still was her frown terrible, and still did the hapless Verezzi tremble at the tones of her voice, as, in a frenzy of desperate passion, she bade him quit her for ever. "And," added she, "go, disclose the retreat of the outcast Matilda to her enemies. Deliver me to the Inquisition, that a union with her you detest may fetter you no longer." Exhausted by breathless agitation, Matilda ceased. The passions of her soul flashed from her eyes. 10,000 conflicting emotions battled in Verezzi's bosom. He knew scarce what to do, but, yielding to the impulse of the moment, he cast himself at Matilda's feet and groaned deeply. At last the words, "I am ever yours, I ever shall be yours," escaped his lips. For a time Matilda stood immovable. At last she looked on Verezzi. She gazed downwards upon his majestic and youthful figure. She looked upon his soul-illumined countenance, and tenfold love assailed her softened soul. She raised him. In an oblivious delirium of sudden fondness, she clasped him to her bosom, and in wild and hurried expressions asserted her right to his love. Her breast palpitated with fiercest emotions. She pressed her burning lips to his. Most fervent, most voluptuous sensations of ecstasy revelled through her bosom. Verezzi caught the infection. In an instant of oblivion, every oath of fidelity which he had sworn to another, like a baseless cloud, dissolved away. A Lethean torpor crept over his senses. He forgot Julia, or remembered her only as an uncertain vision, which floated before his fancy more as an ideal being of another world, whom he might hereafter adore there, than as an enchanting and congenial female to whom his oaths of eternal fidelity had been given. Overcome by unutterable transports of returning bliss, she started from his embrace. She seized his hand. Her face was overspread with a heightened colour as she pressed it to her lips. "And are you then mine? Mine for ever?" rapturously exclaimed Matilda. "Oh, I am thine, thine to all eternity," returned the infatuated Verezzi. "No earthly power shall sever us. Joined by congeniality of soul, united by a bond to which God himself bore witness." He again clasped her to his bosom, again, as an earnest of fidelity, imprinted a fervent kiss on her glowing cheek, and, overcome by the violent and resistless emotions of the moment, swore that nor heaven nor hell should cancel the union which he here solemnly and unequivocally renewed. Verezzi filled an overflowing goblet. "Do you love me?" inquired Matilda. "May the lightning of heaven consume me, if I adore thee not to distraction. May I be plunged in endless torments, if my love for thee, celestial Matilda, endures not for ever." Matilda's eyes flashed fiercest triumph. The exultingly delightful feelings of her soul were too much for utterance. She spoke not, but gazed fixedly on Verezzi's countenance. Chapter 14. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.